You all, and welcome to the first of our policy dialogue series for 2022. Happy New Year to you all, and hope this year will be better than last year. Today we're looking at the topic, why Zimbabweans just don't matter to South Africa. Implications of protectionism and political crisis on human rights and regional stability. The backdrop or the context is the recent subject of the Zimbabwean exemption permits and the threat of another spate of xenophobia in South Africa. The backdrop being the worsening crisis, economic and political, in Zimbabwe. And we want to look at the extent to which this continues to impact not only on South Africa, but at the region. We are also looking at the region in which there's been no implementation of the SADC Protocol on freedom of movement, a protocol that we worked on in mid-80s. And in contrast to what is happening in other regions of Africa, where ECOWAS, for example, has a protocol on a common approach on migration, and the ECOWAS, COMESA, and the East African Community have a protocol on freedom of movement of persons, labor, and services. Significantly, the president of Kenya a few weeks ago boasted about this aspect, making very clear that the citizens of Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda, all the citizens need to have is an ID, and they can move into any country, any of those countries, for work or for residence. So, to help us with the subject, we have experts and public intellectuals alike. Our main presenter is Lauren Landau, a professor of migration and development, and the founder of the African Center for Migration and Society. Welcome, Lauren. Then
Thank
we
you.
have Jan Jo, a Zimbabwean, described as a confident, hardworking, and committed human rights defender and an international relations expert. She's a director of ZimCode. Last but not least, Mwale Simbeki, political analyst, public intellectual, author, entrepreneur. These are the three that will help us in this discussion. And I'll call on Lauren. I don't know how long you need, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, it's up to you. Lauren.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I don't imagine actually speaking for more than 10 minutes, and I think that the group that I'm looking at the names on my screen, and I think that there are people here who have insights probably far greater than mine on the particular matters at hand. By way of framing, I would just say that, of course, Zimbabwean migration and migration to South Africa is nothing new. It has always been wrapped up in the politics of the region, whether that was the politics of apartheid and the need for labor for the mines, whether it's the politics of liberation and South Africans also moving to Zimbabwe at some point and elsewhere in the region, or whether it's the new politics of post-apartheid South Africa, and I think what we're going through is perhaps South Africa's second transition, which is manifesting itself or occurring at the same time amidst a sort of growing economic crisis, growing in economic inequality, and rising populism. When we look at this, we can say all of the common sense, if we look at it from an economic perspective, if we look at it human perspective, common sense would say, open the border, create regional labor markets, integrate economically. These are things that post-94, the SADC Free Movement Protocol, the movement of goods, of people, was supposed to achieve. These are obviously the same kind of impulses that are behind the African Union's effort to create a sort of borderless Africa or an African passport. But even, of course, as Dlamini Zuma, former chair of the African Union, was proposing an Africa-wide passport, South Africa was imposing new controls, her home country, new controls, new restrictions, an effort to tighten border controls. In the last few weeks, at the very end of last year, South Africa finally ended what had started as something called the Zimbabwean Special Dispensation Permit, an effort to regularize hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans who'd been living in the country since the mid to late 2000s. That is just one part of a broader effort that we're seeing from across the political spectrum to control, to regulate, to protect South African jobs, to protect South African people, to protect the South African nation from immigration, from immigrants, particularly low or semi-skilled immigrants from across the region. The response to this has been manifold. I think what we see from the advocates, of which I'm a part, a migrant rights advocate, is an outrage, is a sense of betrayal, a sense that the solidarity that we might expect has been betrayed, a sense that South Africa seems now to be working not just against Zimbabwe's interest, but against its own interest in shutting itself off from the region. However, what we're seeing from the other side of the spectrum is popularity, is a sense that this is something that should have happened a long time ago, that why were these people even here, that they should have gone home, gone back and fixed Zimbabwe. It is not South Africa's responsibility to speak or to supply, to support everyone. And I think that is a natural response. I'm not saying it is a proper response, but it is a response that we would see almost anywhere. In a country where you have 40, 50% unemployment, I saw today a statistic of 66% youth employment. Selling immigrants, saying that we should recognize and welcome immigrants into South Africa was always going to be a hard sell. And saying that we should do it based on historical solidarity is an argument that is always going to be lost on people who were barely born, on the born frees, the people who may not even remember a time when Zimbabwe stood with South Africa and its anti-apartheid struggle. So instead of expecting solidarity, I think we could though ask, should we not be expecting South Africa to be acting in its own interest? And as I said, part of the economic argument has always been there. More movement throughout the region, remittances, flows, investment in different places is likely to be good for South Africa. Immigration coming into South Africa appears in almost all of the economic analysis to generate jobs rather than take jobs. Yes, some people will lose, some people will be exploited, but on aggregate, the investments, the skills, the energy, the trade that comes with migration would be good for South Africa. And clearly for South African companies, closer relationships with the region could be very powerful. In 2008, MTN, one of the largest cell phone companies here, lost tremendous amounts of business, or at least tremendous amounts of money, when the Nigerian government struck back and fined them, ostensibly because they did something wrong with their SIM card registration, but effectively to send a message to South Africa that, look, we are watching. If you want to invest in the rest of the continent, you should do more for citizens, our citizens, for African citizens who are living in South Africa. But those economic arguments haven't gotten very far, in part because those companies are not prepared to stand out publicly and speak on behalf of immigrants, in part because they're not organized, and in part because they've decided to just allow South African politics to exist as it is while they've gone elsewhere. What we have seen, however, is certain segments of the South African economy or economic interests push very strongly against economic regulation or for regulation of immigration, Some of this comes from Black economic and entrepreneurs and others in the South African economy who want their businesses to be protected and feel that they will do well. And perhaps that is a legitimate effort at transformation. There's also others, perhaps getting contracts from the state, perhaps controlling businesses who are inefficient, who do not want competition from elsewhere. And oddly, we're seeing one of the most organized elements of the South African economy, the sugar industry, soybeans, working very hard to undermine forms of regional integration, forms of efforts of building common economies, because those industries need to be protected. And somehow they have helped frame the discussion about protecting South Africa, protecting South African jobs, protecting South African industry. And that has helped drive, or at least prevent, some of the move towards regional integration and a free movement of goods, but also a free movement of people. But what I think is really behind this, and I think this is where we're getting it wrong when we expect solidarity, is that South Africa right now is, as I began by saying, amidst an economic crisis. Perhaps no worse than other places in the world, but what we see is an extraordinarily discontented South African population. We saw it in the protests that happened last year, that started in KwaZulu-Natal, came up to South Africa, to Johannesburg. We see it all the time in protests, in resistance, in violence, as people are looking at a future where they don't know if they'll have jobs, where they don't know if they will be secure, whether they don't know if they have houses. And the political parties that are meant to lead, meant to provide, have no message for them. The ANC has run out of ideas. It seems more concerned with its own internal battles. The other parties really have no other economic plan. But what they do have is a promise, an empty promise, but a promise nonetheless, that if we get rid of foreigners, we will fix South African problems. They learned this from the streets. They learned this from the violence that happened in 2008, when local level politicians made these kind of arguments, when they kicked people out of townships, when they closed Somali shops, when they kicked Zimbabweans out at that point. The politicians were watching. Those ones who led those small-scale attacks have flourished. They have gone unpunished. They have continued to thrive and continued to sell that message. And then that message moved up. It was always there to some extent, but controlled by the kind of Pan-Africanism and the lingering solidarity of the region. But now all of the political parties in South Africa, none of which have an economic plan for their country, none of which have a good idea of how they're going to address unemployment among the youth. They're fighting hand over fist to show which one of them can be the most anti-immigrant. The economic freedom fighters, who, despite all of their problems and issues and theatrics in the past, have always been clear that what they wanted was a borderless Africa, that the enemy was white monopoly capital, not Zimbabweans, not Mozambicans. As of yesterday, we started to see that very party and the leader of that party going to restaurants, going to businesses that hire immigrants, and telling those businesses that those jobs are for South Africans. There is not a political actor of any power, of any weight in South Africa who is standing up for immigrants, standing up for solidarity with our neighbors at a human level. And I think we have to understand this as rooted in South African politics. It's not about the region. It's not about a vision. The vision of the politics in this country now is about fixing South African problems, but in a short-term way, it's about fixing them and getting politicians elected. And until we start to think about how we mobilize domestically, how we move beyond a call for solidarity, a call to protect the rights of immigrants, we're not going to be able to speak that language of a real politique. And I think that's where us as immigrants, as advocates, need to start figuring out what can we do domestically to shift that narrative. Not to say immigrants can be protected, and clearly not even to make an argument that immigration is good for South Africa in the long term. Yes, those arguments must continue to be made, but until we are smarter and until we figure out what is driving this kind of politics of protectionism, we are never going to get anywhere. So just in conclusion to say the expectation of solidarity, the expectation of a protection of migrant rights in an era of mass inequality, growing unemployment, growing infrastructure decay is an unrealistic expectation. Instead, we should be expecting more of what we've seen, more protectionism, more closure. And we need new strategies, and I don't have them, but we need new strategies, and hopefully we can discuss them today for how we address some of the politics that is driving these processes. So let me leave it there. I'm going to turn over to my colleagues and others on the panel, who I'm sure have much more interesting things to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. You gave us a very depressing situation. Looks like we're going nowhere, and the threats are right at our doorstep. And I'm hoping that our next speaker will also throw some light on the elephant in the room, Zimbabwe. Although the issue of migrants is not restricted to Zimbabweans, but clearly the Zimbabwean crisis, and one in which almost 75% of all entrepreneurial, skilled, and professional Zimbabweans are outside the country in the diaspora. And many millions, I believe, it's not clear, we talk about 2 million officially, but I'm sure it's more like 3-4 million people there. We Zimbabweans are everywhere in the various sectors, health, education. And apart from the negative impact of mass migration into South Africa, you can also imagine the impact of attrition of skills in the Zimbabwean situation. It accounts for numerous problems, political and economic. So we are in a crisis. We are a region in crisis. Janet, Joe, I introduced you already before you arrived. I hope you are ready to speak, Janet.
Thank you very much, Doc, for this opportunity. And thank you, Lorraine, I think, for aptly putting the migration issue from the academic and experience perspective that you have. As already introduced, I'm Janet Jo. I work with the Zimbabwe Coalition on Data and Development. And I'm also part of a network of social movements called the Southern Africa People Solidarity Network. And within that space and network is where we discuss issues around the plight of migrants in the region, and most importantly to South Africa, given the recent trends of xenophobic attacks, which to some of the social movements that we work with within the sub-scene, it's actually an issue of Afrophobic attacks to some extent. And from some studies that we have seen that were carried out, just some small surveys that have been carried out, like in Cape Town, there was an attitudinal studies in the informal sector in Cape Town, which indicated as well that the most disliked nationality amongst those that were surveyed were Zimbabweans. And when we are talking about this, we are talking about 24%, given maybe the conservative numbers that we have been given, who constitute the foreign immigrants in South Africa. So we really have a big issue, and we're talking about maybe 2.9 million or so people that have migrated to South Africa from Zimbabwe. Some professionals, some not professionals, but to go and look for a livelihood in South Africa or in neighboring countries, and some are far off. So I think Zimbabweans constitute quite a huge number of migrants in different countries in the SADC region, but at African level as well, and even globally to some extent. But I think when we are analyzing this, the difference is that we've seen migration. It has got a historical perspective in line with the system that has been there before. It could be of colonialism, imperialism, but the capitalist system as well, which has always sought to find cheap labor for purposes of developing economies or limelight kind of economies like South Africa. Maybe at some point we also had quite a number of immigrants coming into Zimbabwe. But the difference maybe from the historical perspective, while it's maybe Wenela was for, as an example, for labor, but we know that we had Mozambicans migrating because of war and the like. So the difference is that if it's war, we are likely to accept those kind of refugees, would understand them. And I think the citizens on the ground initially may be moved by empathy, by the spirit of Ubuntu that every African almost has. They will accept and will take those kinds of people to protect them and maybe to make them have a life and a livelihood to some extent. But the difference now with the Zimbabweans is that we are not in a war kind of situation, but most of the Zimbabweans that have moved in terms of the millions that we are talking about have moved because of economic issues, the economic challenges and crises that we have faced. And these economic challenges have caused many or the majority of the Zimbabweans to live in extreme poverty. Of course, I will talk about the current figures of almost 50% of Zimbabweans living in extreme poverty, almost 50% of Zimbabweans living on less than $29.80, which is the UN benchmark per month for a person to at least have a decent meals and have a decent life. That's like the lowest, the base. Most of Zimbabweans, actually the majority at 49%, live below that $29.80. And over the years, we have also seen inequalities, which I think is what Zimbabweans have also read in terms of those Zimbabweans that made a deliberate decision to actually leave this country, leave their families, leave their loved ones, or move with their loved ones to neighboring countries to look for better opportunities. The issue of inequalities to access to opportunities, to education, to public services, to employment opportunities. So, and this has been caused by the issue of leadership and the politics that we currently have. That has meant that there is patronage in most of the sectors. So, which has left ordinary Zimbabweans who are not politically connected, not employed, maybe not educated at all, because there's no support for public services or for social services and the like. So the inequalities have deepened and people have lost hope. Where inequalities deepen, people lose hope in their leadership. They lose hope in ever getting opportunities. So they leave. So that is one of the reasons as well that has caused most Zimbabweans to leave. Then the unemployment. Our unemployment, if we are not to consider the informal sector, which is just a survivalist economy, maybe it's at about 90%, because the informal sector is huge. Most of the people are not employed in Zimbabwe. So with this is what has caused most of the Zimbabweans to leave and to go to South Africa and other countries. And from this perspective, it would therefore mean that as the influx is taking place, the people, the host, and the communities and the citizens in those countries, they also feel the pressure, because these are people that are going to look for opportunities, and hostilities are likely to happen and to take place. But from where I'm sitting, I think this is when then there is a call for regional cohesion in terms of dealing with the crisis that is in the country that is pushing citizens out, but also to deal with how do we ensure that the receiving country, or where they are the pull factors, how does it deal with that situation to ensure that people are taken care of, human rights are respected. When I look at this in terms of the regional cohesion, human rights, and ensuring that the movement is linked to development, the region, I think, despite the protocol that we are talking about, there is a general acceptance of movement of goods, movement of the minerals, movement of all sorts of, capital. But the citizens themselves, I think this remains a big issue which the region has to deal with. That if we are accepting and facilitating the movement of goods, maybe professional services, infrastructural equipment, and the like, then there is need for us to consider how we protect the citizens themselves. And in the case of Zimbabwe, I think this issue cannot be dealt with first without with the SADC as a bloc coming together and addressing the Zim crisis decisively. The citizens in Zimbabwe have called over the years, I think in the past 3 or 4 elections, for mediation and intervention by the SADC region. This is where I think we stand in terms of the regional cohesion as a bloc to address the migration issues, the challenges that the Zimbabweans who are in South Africa are facing. So the SADC as leadership, as a bloc, has to deal with the current crisis in Zimbabwe, be it political, the economic crisis, and give us something, a settlement that will allow then the citizens to sit and development to start to trickle down. And we have citizens getting employed. We have people that we begin lifting people from the extreme poverty where they are in. We begin to address the inequalities, and particularly the causes that have to do with corruption, that have to do with abuse of public funds, that have to do with excessive power that is wielded by the executive to the point that there is no oversight, and there is arbitrary decisions, policies, and legal frameworks that are put in place that continue to disadvantage the citizens. So this is where I feel that the region, when we're talking about cohesion and addressing the Zimbabwean immigration issue, which would maybe replicate in all other countries, depending with the levels of migration, we have to deal with the root causes from where the citizens are being pushed from. Then from the South African perspective, I think we have to accept that the Zimbabweans are also kind of subsidizing, the middle economy status of Zimbabwe in terms of providing the labor, the cheap labor that currently they give in restaurants, in farms, in mines, in factories. So we also have to deal with the system. And I think Lorraine has spoken to that in terms of how South Africa maybe protects its investments, is also protecting, its economy and the like. But we need to address the South African imperialism as a threat actually to regional cohesion, but also to regional stability, and have us understand that the capital system, or the capitalist system that we currently have, will not hold the region together. We need to address the deeply embedded issues of migrant labor, or the systems that are there that profits the sectors that I have spoken to. So that is something that we really need to deal with, because from where I am sitting, I hear, like I said, the citizens in South Africa, they also feel the pressure, but the state itself, or the government and leadership, has to deal with this in terms of ensuring that they do not then sponsor xenophobia, either by statements or actions or policy. And we get something that is holistic, that will ensure that we give reasonable prospects as well to the migrants that may be there, for them to maybe live legally, for them to also maybe compete in some sectors if they have to with the citizens in South Africa. But I do understand the challenges as well that that South Africans have, and it is not only their issue that they will have to deal with in that regard, but we have to face the South African imperialism as a threat that we actually have to deal with. So the responses to me lie in, of course, we have to revisit. I think I've emphasized the issue of the SADC cohesion as a bloc, and have a policy framework that we review and say, where are we in terms of ensuring that the human in investments in the economy, whether it's in crisis or it's booming, investments are protected, the economies are protected, but we also deal with the root causes of the problems that have caused this migration. I just wanted to raise another issue that so the Zimbabwean migrants, they are between a hard rock, honestly, and a hard place. In South Africa, they are not wanted, they're working as cheap labor and the like. Here back home, they're making remittances that they are sending to their families and to their loved ones, subsidizing this government that is in power as we speak. So this is the conundrum that the Zimbabwean citizens find themselves in. They are subsidizing in South Africa in terms of cheap labor. They are subsidizing here in Zimbabwe in terms of remittances. And this cannot be dealt with in isolation, where we are just chasing them away from South Africa. If South Africa would want to do this, then they must take leadership in terms of calling the government in Zimbabwe to order, calling it out in terms of addressing the current challenges and crises that have caused the citizens to move. And the pandemic has actually exacerbated this challenge. So we are also doing this in a context of COVID-19, where in every family, they're saying at least one person in 5 or so families, they lost their jobs. So this is a big issue. And when we are also facing displacements here in Zimbabwe, there are displacements that are taking place because of a system, a capitalist system, a neoliberal system as well, which is a regional, I believe, system that the region has taken up in terms of regionalizing capitalism and neoliberalism. So internally here, people are being displaced. We know, for example, Chilonga in Zimbabwe, people have been displaced, people are being threatened with displacements to give opportunity to big businesses. So we are in a quandary, in a conundrum that we have to deal with and extricate the citizen from the economic argument of migration, but there is also the political argument to this migration in terms of leadership. That if we want to address the challenges that may be the pressure that South Africa and other countries are facing when it comes to the Zimbabwean migrants, then the political question has to be handled by the SADC region and address the political question in Zimbabwe as well. Then we can begin to rebuild Zimbabwe and ease the pressure from South Africa. So what I look forward is a policy and conversations in terms of how do we address this in a two kind of pronged way or three-pronged way. We're dealing with issues in South Africa, but we're dealing with issues in Zimbabwe on the ground as citizens, but we are also addressing this at the regional block in terms of how do we assist and be in solidarity with the citizens in Zimbabwe by calling their government to order. Thank you very much. I hand you over back the mic.
Thanks, Janet. Thank you very much. Just a few questions. You keep pleading to SADC, but for most of us, SADC is virtually non-existent. And if you can, they just had a summit a few days ago. One would have expected that South Africa in particular would have demanded that the Zimbabwe crisis be put on the agenda. What you have, in fact, on the contrary, is absolute silence from the Zimbabwe side. We have heard nothing from the Zimbabwean government with respect to the impending crisis in South Africa and the impending and imminent xenophobia. What we have had the Minister of Home Affairs of South Africa, Motsoaledi, we had invited him to this discussion, but not even an acknowledgement of our invitation. At least he has spoken on the extent to which the Zimbabwean crisis has impacted on South Africa. And yet there's been no response on the Zimbabwean side. The Zimbabwean government behaves as if there's no crisis at all, neither in Zimbabwe nor in South Africa with respect to Zimbabwean migrants in that country. So, Janet, how do we go about prompting SADC to put this matter on the agenda, and including the protocol on freedom of movement, which was drawn up in 1985, I think? What would be the way forward, Janet?
I think this is really something that I would also. Sorry, I think I was on mute. This is something that we need to address, I guess, beyond as well this policy dialogue in terms of, I think, Lorraine and yourself, Prof. Mandaza, you spoke to it in terms of it's not only Zimbabwe that has faced this issue. So it is a regional issue, and the trends in terms of migration, in terms of movement of people, is a regional trend and phenomenon that we are seeing, and that I think as civil society, as the citizens ourselves, be it social movements, the academia, the media, and the like, we have to take on. I spoke about displacements, for example, in Zimbabwe, and gave one example of Chilonga. But we can also talk about the 800,000 people that are in Cabo Delgado, you know, which was the displacements and the conflicts that we have seen being triggered by the largest foreign investment project in Africa to extract gas in Cabo Delgado is an example for export into the South African market and abroad. So South Africa still comes in. And for me, I think from where I'm sitting and the efforts that we're trying to make in terms of resolving these conflicts, because this is a conflict that we're talking about, and it's an impending implosion, as you have put it. And I think South Africa has to play that leading role in terms of ensuring that we limit, or we actually mitigate on the humanitarian and the human rights crisis that we are facing due to xenophobia, but to the different conflicts that are going to explode because of the kind of investments, because of the kind of economic system or model that that the region has taken. So I'd want to say that I think it is high time that we converge as citizens at some level, including the many South Africans who are empathetic, who still ride on the Ubuntu value, for us to rally together and see the problem not as the Zimbabwean migrant issue, but a regional problem that is coming from the structural, that is coming from the systemic issues and the institution called SADC, as you have put it, and how inept it has been. So we need to address it at those three levels. And it is for us citizens to have these kind of conversations, but action, I think, is more important. And I think there are platforms where we can actually begin to carry out the action, be led maybe by the faith-based organizations, have mediation that we have to have. I think there are a lot of interventions that we could carry out that are citizens-led. Because I think at the government level, we have tried this. It includes as well the implementation of the protocol, as you have put it of 1995, that we have to deal with and say what we have seen. And also in COVID-19 is that goods continue to move, but it remains a challenge for the citizens to move just the same way as the goods are moving. We've been talking, for example, about portable pensions, given the Wenela situation where there is billions of dollars in the South African economy, which cannot be accessed by the former or ex-employees of different mines during the Wenela period. We're talking about cash transfers. We're talking about different things that can connect us as citizens for us to be able to tackle this challenge. But for me, I think the citizens' action is the best that we can take, and we have to be pushing for South Africa to take leadership in this case. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. We'll move now to Moletsi Mbeki. I want to acknowledge the fact that it was through Moletsi that this discussion is taking place. He has been an active factor in the South African context with respect to this subject. I'll now invite Moletsi. Moletsi.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. I can see you too.
Okay. Thanks, Ibo, and thanks for everybody for. I think this is a very important discussion. From where I'm sitting, I think what is not being addressed is the heart of the problem, and the source of population movement from Zimbabwe to the rest of Southern Africa. I think I'd rather see what is going on in that context. What are the factors that are driving population movement from Zimbabwe to the rest of Southern Africa? From my point of view, the reason, in fact, there is one reason which is driving the population movement from Zimbabwe to the rest of the region. And it is how ZANU-PF decided it was going to maintain its political power. That ZANU-PF decided it was going to maintain its political power in 2000, and it adopted a certain modus operandi in order to stay in power, whatever the Zimbabwean electorate decided. And that is what is behind the driving of the population to exit Zimbabwe. From what I understood ZANU-PF's strategy was to disenfranchise sections of the population which it saw as supporting the movement for democratic change. One of the main constituencies that were supporting the movement for democratic change were the commercial farm workers. I worked for the mass media in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, and I did several stories about what was happening in the commercial farming sector. The workers in commercial agriculture in Zimbabwe were becoming unionized by trade unions affiliated to the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, which was one of the partners that initiated the formation of the movement for democratic change in Zimbabwe. So one of ZANU-PF's first strategies after it lost the referendum in January, I think it was January 2000, was to decide who were they going to disenfranchise when a national election came. And one of the first groups who they were going to disenfranchise were the commercial farm laborers. There were workers in the commercial farms who were, a lot of them were unionized, many of them were in workers' committees, and the trade unions and the NGOs, by the way, Save the Children's Fund was very instrumental in helping the organization of farm workers. They set up clinics together with the workers' committees, together with the trade unions on the commercial farms. They set up clinics, they set up creches, they set up beer halls, which paid for the clinics and the creche, so that the children of the farm workers did not have to go to the farm with the mother. Zimbabwe's agriculture at that time, I don't know now, was very advanced, and it used a lot of chemicals, and there was a lot of poisoning of children who were with their parents on the farms. So the farm workers in Zimbabwe, that was the first target that ZANU-PF decided they were going to disenfranchise the farm workers. Now, to disenfranchise the farm workers, you had to destroy commercial agriculture, which we all know how this was done with the war vets. As that was the first group that was targeted to be removed from their homes, to be removed from the voters' roll, and then it was allowed to leave the country to go to the neighboring countries, including South Africa. So at the heart of this population movement in Zimbabwe is how ZANU-PF stays in power. ZANU-PF has been steadily destroying the economy of Zimbabwe in order for it to stay in power. Now, we all know the central role of commercial agriculture in Zimbabwe as a multiplier in the Zimbabwean economy. The Zimbabwean manufacturing sector, a huge part of its manufacturing was processing agricultural products. So when you destroy the commercial agricultural sector, you also destroy manufacturing in Zimbabwe. So you then destroy the jobs for the urban workers. Now, the urban workers also voted for the movement for democratic change. So by destroying their jobs, ZANU-PF knew that they were forcing them out of the country because they would have to leave the country to go and find a living somewhere else. So they were forcing the exit of these key population groups, the workers in commercial agriculture and the workers in the manufacturing sector in Zimbabwe. And this is what has been going on for the last 20 years. It's not something new that started yesterday. Now, I can go down the road to show the cascade of other sections of the Zimbabwe society that were impacted, which were then forced these populations to have to exit their own country because of ZANU-PF's methods of staying in power. So that's one side of the equation. The other side was the ANC's position. The ANC felt that civil society and the trade unions were the only really credible potential opposition to them in terms of political power. The ANC, for example, had opposed the emergence of the movement for MMD in Zambia. The ANC supported the one-party system in Zambia, President Kaunda's unique one-party system, and was opposed to the emergence of MMD. I was there, I was in the ANC research department. I knew Chiluba, Newstead, Zimba, all those guys, I had talked to them. The ANC was opposed to them setting up the MMD. It was opposed to the setting up of the MDC, and it collaborated, and it opened the borders of South Africa to enable the population that was forced to exit Zimbabwe because of the destruction of their livelihoods by ZANU-PF's policies. It opens the borders of South Africa to enable these populations to exit Zimbabwe so that they don't put pressure on the ZANU-PF government in Zimbabwe. For example, they removed the army. This is the ANC. The South African borders have always been controlled by the army during the apartheid era and after the ANC came to power. But they removed the army control of the border and handed over the border to the police, knowing fully well the police had no capacity to control the border of South Africa. South Africa has a 3,000-kilometer border, land border with its neighbors. The police don't have the capacity to control the borders of the country. So the removal of the army from border control, replacing them with the police who couldn't control the borders, which the ANC government knew they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the skills, they didn't have what it takes to control the border. This was to enable ZANU-PF to kick out the population that was going to vote against ZANU-PF. And that's how ZANU-PF stayed in power. Now, that was the ANC strategy, was to enable ZANU-PF to stay in power, to make sure that what happened in Zambia, where the movement, the political party of civil society, MMD, defeated UNIP, to ensure it did not happen in Zimbabwe. That's why they opened the borders of South Africa to allow the population whose livelihoods were being destroyed by ZANU-PF's policies to come to South Africa. And of course, that's the heart of the matter. These policies are still continuing today. So a lot of the talk about migration and this, that, and that. Why did the ANC, for example, have the exemption permit system? It was precisely to make sure that especially the younger adults who came to South Africa, to make it convenient for them not to go back to Zimbabwe to go and oppose ZANU-PF regime. It was to enable them to stay in South Africa rather than having to go back home to oppose the regime. If the ANC, as our Minister of Home Affairs argues, he said, "Oh, we had a flood of people asking for political asylum, therefore we introduced this exemption system." That is his story. That is not the truth. The reality is that movement of population in Africa is controlled by the OAU and AU Refugee Convention. I was a refugee for nearly 30 years in the rest of Africa. My stay in Zimbabwe as a refugee, my stay in Tanzania as a refugee was controlled under the OAU Refugee Conventions. South Africa did not apply the OAU Refugee Conventions precisely because it wanted to help the ZANU-PF regime by encouraging the population to leave Zimbabwe instead of opposing the ZANU-PF regime. So that, in my book, is the heart of the matter. Now, I was in the trade unions in the early 90s when I came back from South Africa. And I was one of the people who worked with COSATU in particular to oppose what ZANU-PF was doing. We even sent a delegation to Zimbabwe, which was deported the minute it arrived in Zimbabwe to show solidarity to the people of Zimbabwe. This delegation was put in the bus and deported. The ANC government said nothing. It never protested about the manhandling of the delegation. It never protested that this was a violation of protocols and relations between South Africa and Zimbabwe, deportations of innocent people who. So the collaboration between the ANC and ZANU-PF is what has put us where we are today. Now, why all of a sudden is the ANC now turning on the Zimbabwean people in South Africa? For the simple reason that the ANC is losing power itself. It is in the position that ZANU-PF was in 2000. The ANC is in the same position. So it is now looking for scapegoats to attack for its loss of support by the population of South Africa. And it is turning on the Zimbabwean people in South Africa and saying, you are responsible for us losing votes, and therefore we are going to deport you. So they are using, ZANU-PF and the ANC are using this population as a football, which they kick backwards and forwards. And we have to, we, the citizens of Southern Africa, have to fight against this. And we have to see it for what it is. It's got nothing to do with migration. It's to do with these two parties staying in power, and they're abusing the welfare of these populations. EFF is joining this bandwagon. Herman Mashaba is also joining this bandwagon of abuse of African populations by the politicians to be a football for them to kick them backwards and forwards, generate xenophobia and all these kinds of attacks. But at the heart of the matter is the disenfranchisement of the Zimbabwean population, the urban population, the working class population in the rural areas and in the industrial sector who didn't vote for ZANU-PF. And they try, and of course, in Ndebele, that is another group that did not vote for. So those were the key groups that were being disenfranchised by ZANU-PF in its effort to stay in power. And the ANC collaborated with it, and it still collaborates with it today. I think I'll end there, Ibo. Thank you.
Interesting perspective, Olesi. What's to be done? What is the nature of the debate in South Africa in terms of what do you understand to be the current thinking within the ANC government on this problem, if at all?
Well, the current thinking of the ANC is what the Minister of Home Affairs is doing, is to find scapegoats for the loss of votes for the ANC. If you look at the last election which we had last year, the local government election, for the first time, the ANC majority fell below 50%, which there's another election in 2 years' time, which is the national election, what happened in the local government election is telling us that the ANC is going to lose, or it has a high probability of losing power in the 1924 general election. So to try and regain the vote of the urban working class, because that's what if you look at who stopped voting in South Africa, we had a low voter turnout. The big component of the low voter turnout was the African urban working class in the big metros. They are the ones who didn't vote. And they were the backbone of the ANC vote before. Now, once they stopped voting for the ANC, then the ANC lost its majority. Now the ANC is going to this population, to this electorate, and it is saying to them, oh, the reason why you are unemployed, why unemployment is growing in the urban areas is because of Zimbabwe migrants. Therefore, we are going to kick out the Zimbabwe migrants. So that is the response of the ANC to its loss of, but it's not about the welfare of the Black workers in South Africa. It's about the ANC looking for a formula to stay in power, but by finding scapegoats for the failure of its economic and social policies.
What about the attitude of the South African working class themselves in terms of their attitude towards the foreign migrants, including Zimbabweans? Isn't that a feature in itself, which doesn't require South Africa, the ANC having to mobilize. It looks like they're already mobilized against foreigners.
You see, one of the challenges which we have in South Africa with the growing deindustrialization, remember, ANC's policies, neoliberal economic policies, have driven the deindustrialization of the South African economy during the last 25 years. So a big section of the working class in South Africa is suffering unemployment, has come under unemployment, informalization, casualizations. So, and then most importantly, this is leading to the weakening of the organizations of the working class in South Africa, of the Black working class in South Africa. So organizations like COSATU are enormously weakened compared to, ironically, what they were under the apartheid era, where they were very powerful organizations. Today, they are a pale shadow, or a black shadow, maybe I should say, of what they used to be. So we having multiple crises within the urban environment in South Africa. And then you are getting the lumpenization of the working class in South Africa. So then you get the elements, the lumpen elements, who attack foreigners, who think the foreign workers are the cause of their problem. So it is that sort of a complex situation, but primarily driven by the political factors.
Thanks, Moletsi. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you. Eleanor, Sisulu? Eleanor?
Yes, hello, good evening, and thank you for the conversation. Thank you for Moletsi initiating it. And I agree with part of his analysis. There are some parts I don't agree with. For example, I don't think that the ANC has a coherent policy. The ANC is a house divided. And I think what is happening, the Minister of Home Affairs' response, is more a reaction to a deep-seated and violent xenophobia in the community. And if you go back to the nature of these, and I want to talk about Afrophobic violence, attacks on African bodies. Zimbabwean migrancy is an issue, a feature throughout the region. Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi all have large numbers of Zimbabwean migrants. And in fact, Botswana and Namibia, with their small populations, have reason to be more worried because they can be easily swamped. So the problem with in South Africa is that it's the violence of the response, which is not a feature in any of the other countries. And in fact, the violence of the response, which I can't think of any parallel, maybe except when the Nigerians decades ago, when there was attacks on Ghanaians and Ghanaians were killed and sent back to Ghana. So I think we, in the short term, are dealing with this violent response and how whatever migrant issues there are in South Africa, whether it's caused by, it's not migrants, yes, and I agree with Moletsi, a lot of ZANU-PF's policies, whether they did it intentionally or unintentionally, but the consequence is that they've caused a migrant crisis in South Africa. And there's a deeply violent and xenophobic response. I want to talk about a historical experience. In 2010, in the run-up to the World Cup, the World Cup soccer tournament, there were plans for attacks on foreigners. And the plan was that this would happen so that by the time the World Cup happens, that for all foreigners are out of South Africa. And by all foreigners, it's all Africans. And the South African Council of Churches was at the heart of mobilizing a response with civil society, social justice organizations, migrant organizations, which collaborated with the security sector to prevent these attacks. And I think these attacks are reminiscent of the kind of black-on-black violence that took place in South Africa in the 1990s between mostly Zulu hostel residents and township. And South Africa, people never faced consequences for that kind of violence and the killings that took place then. There was a political solution, and South Africans tried to move on from there. But the modus operandi of that kind of violence against communities, vulnerable working class communities in South African urban, peri-urban spaces is the same. It's black on black violence. And some would say, yes, it's the poor attacking the poor, it's competition for resources. But the questions that South Africans have to ask is, why does it take such a violent form, which doesn't happen in the rest of the region? And I think the challenge for me, the first and foremost, is how to stop this violence and how to hold the people accountable. And I don't think the ANC has a deliberate, thought out policy. I think it's just reacting and not knowing what to do. And there is no counter narrative against a movement like Put South Africa First, which is a mobilization of xenophobic forces to remove foreigners, ostensibly undocumented, but when it comes to the actual push and move of people and attacks on people, there's no question of documented or undocumented. And people are even talking about removing foreigners from the universities, etc. So the forces in South Africa that were there, say in 2010, the organizations and the civil society and the social justice and the legal are not there anymore. They've been, well, not that they are not there, they are there, but they have been decapacitated. And the COVID-19 has impacted on them. And so they've been depleted. They don't have the resources, and I think don't have the energy. And South Africans are absorbed with their own internal issues. And what is happening also is that internal political fights are opportunistically xenophobic tropes are being used, so that people who don't have any issue with foreigners, but when it's convenient, this xenophobic tropes are taken up. What is this solution? I think some of the solution lies really in an appeal. South Africa has to address its relationship with the rest of the continent. There has to be a counter narrative developed, which actually a pan-African project for South Africa that helps South Africa to better absorb refugees, asylum seekers, and also to address its relationship with the rest of the continent. And a narrative which says to South Africa that your economy is dependent on trade with the rest of the continent. If you have these attacks and you get isolated by the rest of the economy, the continent, your economy will suffer. It will contract further. And the crisis of contraction of your economy has very little to do with foreign migrants. It's to do with the fact that South African manufacturing is steadily being depleted and cannot compete mainly with the Chinese manufacturing machine. And so this contraction of the manufacturing sector of South Africa is a major factor in the crisis. And, Mazrui said, our problem is that we don't produce what we consume. We don't consume what we produce. And so this crisis of employment lies in issues of consumption and production. And there's need for education. And when I was a student in Zimbabwe, my cousin Ibo there was one of the people who sent groups of us to West Africa. I was very resistant to that. I was sent to Senegal against my wishes, but it was the most transformative, valuable experience of my life. And one of the things I really wish we could have a project that sends young South Africans, influential young South Africans around the continent to actually develop a cadre of South Africans who have an idea of how to better relate to their continent and how to fight these powerful xenophobic forces within their own society. And I want to pay tribute to the South Africans that have fought very hard and risked their own lives in this fight against this Afrophobic attacks.
Thanks, Eleanor. And hello, Max. How are you, Max? I can see you. Tony, thanks, Eleanor, for that. I think the point you made is that really the issue of migrants will not has little or no impact on the level of unemployment in South Africa, really. And as someone argued, I think it was yourself earlier, that assuming you've got all the migrants out of the country, it's doubtful that that will improve the employment opportunities in South Africa. Anyway, Tony Rila. Tony.
Thank you. I posted a question to Lauren, which is answered in the chat. But the motivation for that was that probably about 4 years ago, the organization I work for, RAU, were requested to have a meeting with a couple of World Bank consultants. And their task was to look at migrants in the region and to look at their economic impact. And we were pretty stunned, I mean, because fundamentally the best data they had and the best prospect for research was in fact in South Africa. So they explained their research in detail and didn't give us a copy of the research, I'm afraid. And what they pointed out was that most migrants create at least another job, some more than one. So the beneficial part of having migrants in countries seems to me undisputed, and Lawrence talked about that. But what was interesting to me was that the World Bank folks said, we said, well, can we have a copy of the report? And they said, maybe not. We were really worried about this report because we suspect, and I remember it was pretty close to elections in South Africa, they said this would look like a potential spur for xenophobia. You know, the notion being that Zimbabweans go to South Africa and they create 2 jobs. And I think those of us who travel to South Africa and take Uber or whatever it is, you'll find these sort of networks of groups of migrants who work together, as they have done in the United States and Australia and all these places that have taken immigrants. They tend to go within their communities. And I presume they were frightened that those sort of findings would foster greater xenophobia. So I'd be interested to know, I mean, I've not been able to find that report, but I'd be interested to find out from Lauren whether he had seen that report or what his view is on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Lauren, would you like to come in on that? Lauren?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tony. I mean, I think that the evidence is from almost any reputable research company or university, is that immigrants are generally positive in terms of job creation, in terms of trade for South Africa. There is replacement in certain sectors, obviously hospitality, construction. You're seeing fewer agriculture, fewer jobs there, in part because immigrants are working without documents, so they're easily exploitable. But even there, on aggregate, there's an economic argument to be made. I think what this points to, however, is really that the issue here is not about economics and not about protecting South African jobs. It's about political populism. I mean, we've known from the beginning that a regional labor market would be good for many people, for business, for certainly to help address some of the skills gaps in the short term in the South African economy. But business won't stand up and argue for it. And there's very few people in South Africa who will do it. Instead, anytime immigration comes up, you do, as you suggested, get a kind of populist backlash. And as a result, we've actually been trying to take immigration off the agenda to try to think about how we talk about trade, how we talk about regional integration that is good to create jobs. Because as soon as you start talking about the movement of people across the region, everything else gets taken off the table.
Yes. Thanks, Lauren. Janet, like to come in? Janet?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, Modati, I think, for really explaining some of the issues I was trying to raise in terms of the economic argument, and I think Lauren had spoken to that, but there's also the deeper political connotations to the xenophobic attacks and the migration patterns that we have seen between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And I think besides the issues around the political parties or the liberation political parties and how they have implemented maybe strategies is shared, debatable. But I think one of the key issues when we are looking at the economic push factors that have caused this crisis that we have, the xenophobic or Afrophobic attacks that we have seen. From an economic point of view, I think there is the issue of the primitive accumulation tendencies both in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, with their underpinning, of course, in the economic and political system that we see in both countries. And I think this is at another level. As we address the political issues, the political challenges, the economic challenges, we need to interrogate and see how, as citizens, we dismantle this primitive accumulation, which has meant that if it's in Zimbabwe, citizens have been left with nothing, with no jobs, whether it's in the mining, it's in the agriculture, and all the other sectors where there have been movements to South Africa. Whilst leaving just a few political elites and business elites benefiting in Zimbabwe, thereby maintaining the status quo that we have at the economic level, at the social level, and at the political level. The same applies, I want to believe, in South Africa. If you look at the issues of ownership of the means of production, and I would tend to also agree with Eleanor that it's not just the poor fighting against the poor, but it's a setup where the poor have been set up against each other, for me, by the system that is also obtaining in South Africa. And so the politicians, because of the kind of politics that we have, the conflation. So if you read the South African context and the Zimbabwean context in terms of conflation of business and politics, I think you would pick it from there that the poor themselves are then left set up against each other by a system that is disproportionately and undemocratically benefited, the few political elites, the ruling elites, at the expense of the majority who have been stripped of their livelihoods. So I think at the center as well of this migration crisis that we have to be addressing the system of primitive accumulation, of corruption, of tenderpreneurships, issues around procurement, and the ownership of the means of production at both levels. But one as well, really pushing and ensuring that we are organizing the citizens, I'm sure. In Zimbabwe and in South Africa, I agree with some of the submissions that have been made by Eleanor in terms of exposing a critical mass in South Africa, to connecting with the region, as in the African region or the African continent in different countries, so that they have an understanding as well of how maybe neighboring countries, how Africa, how other SADC countries played a role for South Africa to be where it is now. And it is also time for South Africa to also give back in terms of leadership and addressing the current challenges that we are facing, but not exonerating as well the role that has to be played in Zimbabwe to ensure that we deal with the political crisis that we have that has pushed the citizens out, and thereby disenfranchising them, as has been said, We've been calling, for example, for the diaspora vote for a long time. And from where I'm sitting, we've been linking it to the economic contributions that these Zimbabweans are making in terms of remittances. Right now, remittances sit at number 2 when it comes to the foreign exchange that's coming into Zimbabwe. But these are people that are sending their resources but have no decision making. I have got no say when it comes to the politics, when it comes to the economy, in terms of participation and ownership in the means of production and doing business or investments in the lucrative sectors of the economy, which have been set aside and privatized mainly for the cartel. So we really need to look at this. But for me, I think the ball really rests in building the critical mass amongst the citizens to really understand that this migration crisis that we are facing is an issue where the political elites, the business elites are making their elitist pacts, whether they want to maintain power, whether they want to close out investments from the citizens and locals and indigenous people. We need to address it from that perspective, where we say at the end of the day, we only have this region that we have to deal with. That is actually being plundered by the political elite, by the military, and by the business, and in particular from the east, from the west, that are plundering and looting our resources, whilst we fight each other and we are set up against each other. And I think that is not very difficult to do. I think we share a lot of commonalities in terms of history, in terms of value systems, of respecting, the human life dignity, the sanctity of life, and we must be questioning ourselves when we are implementing violence, as an example, to say, where have we really lost it? Because we share a strong value system as Africans, from the liberation struggle, from fighting colonialism. So where have we gotten it wrong that we get to this? So for me, I think those conversations should be leading to those, so that we do find each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. We're now in plenary. I'm going to ask Pilani Samche to come in, but also just to alert Elizabeth and Stephen from SAIA, if you can come in from the Foreign International Relations perspective, and to what extent the issue of that we're discussing impinges on the foreign policy considerations in South Africa. Also, I'd like to hear from a former Minister of Government, a regular member of our policy dialogue, Fei Chung. What might be the thinking in government in Zimbabwe? What are we hearing? Why is such a silence on this matter? So, Zamchia first.
Thank you, Professor Ibo. I've been enjoying listening to the debate, and I'm more persuaded by this view that it's sheer political populism at play. Because if we look even at the details of this Zimbabwe exemption permit in terms of the decisions that were made, I think first of all, we can actually see that it's utopian. The South African state seems to be out of touch with the local realities. They are kind of trying to engineer society to a degree of perfect social order, which definitely is not going to happen in the way that they think. And let's look at the hypocrisy within the state at this juncture. The state is actually saying those who hold these special permits are given 1 year to apply for the mainstream visas. That's hypocrisy at its highest order, because they tend to forget why the migrants were undocumented in the first place. And one of the main reasons is that the South African mainstream visa regime is hostile to the poor and vulnerable workers. Your domestic workers, Uber drivers, general cleaners, and so forth. And we know that the bulk of these permit holders actually fall in this low-skilled labor category. And this is going to have a huge impact on Zimbabweans living and working in South Africa. And I don't understand why the state, in its utopian imagination, actually thinks that these Zimbabweans are going to leave South Africa or to be deported. Because one, I think there's a historical lesson here that people actually have the capacity to resist. And I think in this case, most of the migrants will simply go underground and become invisible to the state, rather than return to a crisis-torn Zimbabwe to suffer, die, and some still face political persecution. But at the same time, if they go underground, as Moles was saying, they risk exploitation by the capitalist employers. And also, as Eleanor was saying, increased xenophobic attacks. So that's what the South African state is going to achieve. I don't know whether these are intended or unintended consequences. And in the very end, I think South Africa will have to deal with this self-made daily crisis of undocumented migrants in the society. So I don't really then get to understand why they even think that the Zimbabweans are going to return to Zimbabwe. And at the same time, when people become illegible to the state, it means that they won't be able to pay those taxes that they were paying. And all those are negative economic consequences. Thank you, Ibo, as my input.
Thanks very much. Someone else? Elizabeth? Steve? Faye, are you ready to come in? Welcome, Elizabeth.
I'm ready to come in here. Can I come in, or Elizabeth first?
Okay, Elizabeth had a hand first. Elizabeth and then Faye.
Sure.
How are you, Elizabeth? How are you?
I'm well. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to pop out briefly, so I missed some of the conversation, which I hope to catch up on afterwards. But just to make a couple of observations on South Africa's foreign policy in this regard, and I think it's probably I think the points that Zamtria made now are speak directly to that. You know, South Africa since '94 has always focused on how its foreign policy is geared towards Africa, its African agenda. You know, in 2011 with its white paper, it was talking about diplomacy of Ubuntu, and I know that Janet earlier on spoke about Ubuntu. And yet, you know, these initiatives this Home Affairs decision, let's put it this way, so this domestic decision, and at the same time the way in which we have the way in which the state has engaged on xenophobia actually goes against what we espouse as central to our foreign policy. And the fact is that, you know, we've been caught out, so to speak. I mean, I'll never forget a really powerful discussion we had, and Eleanor was in it, was part of that. We organized it together. I think, Eleanor, it was in September 2019, or was it 2018? I can't remember now. Just after the latest in a series of attacks, where a number of people in the audience said, you know, South Africa cannot, African states need to act, other African states actually need to stand up and call South Africa out on this. And the very strong statements that had been made by Nigeria sort of in the days before our workshop actually spoke very much to that. You know, it was 2019. Thanks, Eleanor. This goes to the very core of what our foreign policy is. And if Durka and the government don't recognize that the way in which we're engaging with migrants, the way in which we're engaging with Zimbabweans in particular, because there we've actually also played a role in the crisis, really undermines anything we might espouse in global fora about Africa. And I've just come out of a meeting now on vaccine nationalism and the importance of getting African production of vaccines, etc. All of that rings hollow. And that, I think, is the big challenge that the South African government actually has to countenance and has to deal with if we're really serious about our African credentials, so to speak. And I mean, the point that Lauren made right at the beginning, understandably in terms of the social context, absolutely, ordinary people who are basically battling to put food on the table. That is the response. It's response in South Africa. It's the response in other parts of the world. But we're dealing here fundamentally with a state whose capacity has really eroded significantly over the years. And to hope that, that we deal with crime and that we deal with unemployment through simply getting rid of immigrants is really quite amazing that we think the solutions are so simple. But then how do we come up with innovative ideas, the point that Lauren made, that actually speak to the emotion? Because this is also about emotion at the grassroots. And that is not, you cannot argue with them from in terms of rational arguments. It's a very emotional and very existential challenge which people face, and I think that we haven't gotten right in many of these discussions. And unfortunately, I have to concur with what Lauren made, the point he made, that I also don't necessarily have any specific concrete ways in which we can tackle that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you. Fei Chung.
Thank you very much. I think the presentations so far made have all been excellent. I agree with, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I agree with what Lauren, Janet, and Eleanor have said. All of them are correct. What is the solution? It seems to me that we have some practical things and it cannot be done overnight and very quickly. One of them has already been mentioned, that there are very powerful groups in our societies. The church has already been mentioned. There are others, the traditional leaders. The chiefs are very powerful in their own sphere. Like in Zimbabwe, chiefs still control 60 to 70% of the rural population, and they can and should speak on development programs. We have got the issue of dire poverty mentioned by Janet. More than 50% of Zimbabwe's population do not have enough food. What is the answer? And this is in a country where there's plenty of excellent land and where we've taken some 16 million hectares of land, a lot of which is empty. I think we need to discuss poverty in terms of land. We need to look at the issue that both ANC, ZANU-PF, and the parties behind them in the country only have populism as the main policy. And populism, as we know, leads to fascism and violence in the end. Now we need to have a discussion about the political systems in the various countries. Job creation. Imagine that only 10% of Zimbabweans are in the formal economy, and 90% are in the informal economy. Now we have to do something about the informal economy. What about postgraduate students? Can we not have organized meetings? They can discuss political and economic issues. What about our economists? So what I'm saying is that we need to look at the different political and economic groups in the country and see how they can contribute in the immediate and long term. And I think SADC has a role there. They used to organize educators and ministers of education. And I think they can do this for economists, for doctors, on poverty, on job creation. I think asking SADC to solve our problems is a mistake. I don't think they can solve our problems as an organization, but they can certainly give policy and economic leadership in any of these various special groups. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. Thanks very much. Anyone else? Kadenge? Zimbabweans are too quiet on this problem. You're causing problems next door. Come on. Njozi. Anyone coming in? If not, I'll go back to my panel and begin with. Hello, was it?
Hi, it's Tony here.
Yes.
I mean, there's a central theme that's going through this thing, with this whole discussion, which is, in Zimbabwean terms, the problem is political. I think that was explained extremely well by Moletsi. And the key issue, I mean, South African foreign policy in general terms, yes, foreign policy is confused, as Elizabeth put out, but the foreign policy on Zimbabwe is particularly confused. And I mean, it seems to me that the critical question is, when will the South African government call a spade, right? The reason Zimbabweans are going there is primarily political, whether they go there as economic refugees or they go as people seeking asylum because they're fleeing political violence, but they're going there because the fundamental problem is political. So the political problem that has to be addressed is the political problem within Zimbabwe. It seems to me that's the crux of the problem.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe Moletsi can come in now and also sum up on your part how to deal with these political problems. You were in the earlier discussion last year when we discussed the South African foreign policy on Zimbabwe. You had some very caustic things to say about the lack of policy in that regard. Is there a chance, a window of opportunity now? Listening to the Minister of Home Affairs, Aaron Motsoaledi, he's coming very close to saying things as they are, calling a spade, that the crisis in Zimbabwe is a cause of the migration into South Africa. Anyway, Moletsi, please.
Well, Ibo, you know, as I said, in my view, this is a political crisis. And we can't get away from it, that it is a political crisis. It's caused by the meltdown of ZANU-PF, the loss of support of electoral support from the population of Zimbabwe. We are seeing the same thing in South Africa, the loss of support by the ANC of the electorate. And they are starting to victimize vulnerable population. And as it happens, the vulnerable population in the here and now in South Africa is the Zimbabwean population. But I have no doubt they will find other vulnerable populations of South Africans who they are also going to victimize. So this is the challenge that we are having in Southern Africa, of the former liberation movements becoming neo-fascist organizations, like you see in Frelimo. Frelimo has become a heroin trading regime, but the former liberation movements are defending the heroin trading regime of Frelimo, which is victimizing the Islamic population in Cabo Delgado. So this is a challenge that we are faced with in Southern Africa, all of us, because obviously we have multiracial, multi-ethnic populations, and you have groups that are very easy to victimize when certain elements of the ruling class are losing power. They turn sections of our populations into scapegoats, and they victimize those sections. So this is something that we have to, we all, by we, I mean the progressive part of Southern Africa, we have to be aware of, and we have to start preparing for it. And we have to start working amongst ourselves. If I can digress very briefly, a few years ago, when Morgan Tsvangirai was still alive, we realized that there was a conspiracy amongst the former liberation movements, who are now governments, to set up a forum to repress parties like MDC. So we then set up a forum of opposition parties in SADC. And that's why when HH became president of Zambia, that's why he invited Mmusi Maimane and Nelson Chamisa, who he treated almost as head of state. It's because they had supported him when he was being victimized by Lungu. So we have to revive this organ. Unfortunately, when Mmusi left, the DA and Morgan died, this forum kind of collapsed. We have to revive the SADC forum of opposition parties so that it has the muscle and the ability to address these emerging huge challenges where sections of our populations in Southern Africa are being victimized and are going to continue to be victimized.
Thanks, Molesi. Thank you very much. Janet, your last words for today, I mean. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, it's not for the last time. I think this is one of the areas that I'm going to speak more about, because I think the diagnosis that we are making here is a big one, and it shows us the where the economic mismanagement intersects with the political crisis that we have, that is facilitated this whole crisis that we have, and have prescribed drugs to it when it comes to the migration, without really fully understanding at the leadership level. Or maybe it's not necessarily that they do not understand where the problem is, but not really being sincere in terms of dealing with the root causes that have caused us to be where we are. And I think from this conversation and the agreements that we are making in terms of, this is a political question, this is a political crisis that those that seek to continue to hold on to power, and this is either political power or economic power, have continued to use the narrative that divides us as citizens when it comes to addressing or to challenging them at the economic level and at the political level. We need to, therefore, it means that as citizens, the narrative has to change. And I think for a long time, we've not politicized this conversation of migration to the level that we have done here. We have spoken about it as an economic issue, like we said, economic arguments, they are economic refugees, without really politicizing it and saying, wait a minute, what is happening here, and what is the role of our leadership and those that are holding on to power, and how are they responding to it, and in responding to it, violating human rights, in it killing livelihoods, and in it setting up communities setting up citizens against each other to the point that we have the conflicts that we are having that are violent, that are out of character when it comes to our value system, as I have spoken. So I think that realization can come from a discourse of politicizing the migration issue with regards to the xenophobic attacks that we have seen in South Africa that have turned violent. But as also Eleanor said, it happens, it's subtle in the other countries. It may not have turned violent, but it is there. There's hatred, there's suspicion, there's a feeling of dejection for the host, but also for those that have migrated to those countries. So for me, I think my core and my last word is that the way we have elevated this discussion to a political level is where we have to take it. But the political discourse and narrative has to be owned by the citizens. And how we're going to do that is what we have to think about, is that what we have to converge about in terms of the awareness that we need to raise at the community levels. I want to believe that even at the community level, there were mechanisms that people used to deal with conflicts, people used to deal with hopelessness, people used to deal with what they felt with threats, and those community mechanisms called for dialogue within safe spaces or spaces which are led by those who would have made to understand the situation. So I would say the call is on us to continue to politicize this narrative and give it back to the citizens than having it continue to be at the very elite level where the prescriptions and the solutions are, as Faye said, populist, where we're just saying, let's chase them away, or it's here in Zimbabwe, we make populist policies that do not materialize, and we cause a lot of anxieties in the movements that we have seen that cause the challenges that we are facing. And I would say a dialogue about Zimbabwe and on Zimbabwe has to be carried out for us to address this as a political issue if we are going to move forward. An inclusive dialogue where we say, where are we going, and building the national question, I think is a big issue that we also need to address. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Janet. Lauren?
Lauren had to leave, Ibo.
Oh, he's left.
Yeah.
You like to sum up for him?
Comrade,
I think I'll
pass it to the chair. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I won't try and summarize the discussion at all, but I think 3 takeaways. One is the urgent need for SADC. The conclusion that SADC is useless, but I think we have to do something, either through the various factors in our societies, in our countries, to cause a discussion on the protocol on freedom of movement of citizens in the region, to get SADC to do as ECOWAS and COMESA have done in the East African community. I think it's very important where we have to take it from this discussion, which has been recorded, which should be transcribed and published. But as part of our policy dialogue process is to impact on SADC. Secondly, we need to, Mulesi made the point about this forum of opposition parties. I think we should also talk about a forum of progressives, progressive individuals, progressive organizations. We should come together. We should have a discussion on this matter and bring pressure to bear on our governments, on our respective countries, to adopt a genuine and practical Pan-Africanist position, and thereby use the media, our educational institutions, to educate our populations about the values and principles of Pan-Africanism. And thirdly, is really to to carry the discussion forward. As Eleanor says, we need to have a series of discussions on this in our countries, respective countries, but also on regional forums such as the sub-policy dialogue. I want to thank Lauren, Janet, and Moletsi in particular, but also all those who have participated, Eleanor, Tony Rila, Fei Chung, that have contributed to the discussion. Our next discussion is on the 3rd of February. We're going regional again around the subject of constitutionalism and the rule of law. And in the context of our region, highlighting the tragedy where constitutionalism and rule of law does not exist, such as the case in Zimbabwe, but using the current debate in South Africa on the same subject to highlight the importance of constitutionalism and the rule of law in our societies. So until then, goodbye and good night.
Thank you very much.
Africa, oh, the panda.